Okay, so we're going to look at chapter 5 of writing arguments, and that is using evidence effectively. So we haven't really gotten to the point where we are writing or formulating an argument yet, but when we do, we need to provide appropriate evidence to support our claim and reasons. You need evidence to support the reasons that you put forth. So let's look at what Ramage and Bean talks about, or how they talk about evidence and using it appropriately. We're going to also look at how we use it rhetorically, because the way in which you use evidence is a rhetorical move on your part. News outlets do this all of the time with how they report evidence and how they use evidence. By just omitting certain types of evidence, that's a rhetorical move. By perhaps using raw numbers versus percentages, depending on what you think the emotional impact it might have on your audience will be, that's a rhetorical move that you make as a writer. And you know, as a consumer of information out in the world and arguments that are put forth on the news, in newspapers, on Facebook, other social media outlets, the people use evidence strategically. It is fascinating to look at. If you take in our political arena, if you take something that might be from a Democratic point of view or Democrat point of view and a Republican point of view, the same story, and how just through their use of evidence, the story changes. So we see this sort of manipulation all the time. We experience it, and if you don't think you have experienced it, well, you have in some form or fashion. If you have read an argument or read a newspaper or read anything online that is accounting some sort of factual data and using evidence to support a claim, you have been a part of this process as the reader. So let's look at how writers then use evidence effectively. Excuse me. Okay. So your book talks about applying the STAR criteria to evidence. And this is something that you can kind of keep in your brain. Is the evidence I'm using sufficient? That's the S. Is there enough evidence? A lot of times I will see arguments and evidence used to support that argument. The evidence just, there's not enough of it there. It may be relevant and typical, but it's not sufficient. It's not sufficient amount of evidence. So is your evidence sufficient? Is it typical of the type of evidence that we've used for this argument? That's part of understanding certain disciplines, especially in college, when you're writing papers and you're providing evidence for a paper that you might write for your history professor. Is the evidence is the evidence that you are using typical of what a historian would use to support that claim? Is it typical? That's the T. Accuracy. Is the evidence accurate and up to date? Especially in a especially let's take history again. The date of something is the date of publication of a source is very important depending on the topic. If you're writing about Charlemagne, you probably could have sources that just date back to the 50s or something that was written last year by a graduate student, and that would probably be fine because Charlemagne is way back historically, and more than likely the things that we know about Charlemagne haven't changed that much over the last 50 years. If you're writing about social media, for instance, you really need to pay attention to the date of your publication of that particular source, because if it's something that was published in 2004 even, that's a long time ago in the world of social media and the internet. So the accuracy has a lot to do with when it was published. And then, of course, just the accuracy itself. So sometimes people don't think about the up-to-datedness of it, but that's a very important part of accuracy as well. And you want your evidence to be as accurate as possible. Relevant. Is the evidence relevant to the claim? Again, this sort of goes in line with typical, but is it relevant? Does it relate to that which you're trying to develop and support? So the STAR criteria for gathering evidence, if you can just remember that little acronym there, it will help you out a lot in terms of selecting appropriate evidence. Okay, so in order to select appropriate evidence, we need to understand, sort of have a rhetorical understanding of evidence. Your book talks about a lot of different kinds of evidence. I know that perhaps you might have a very narrow view of what it means to gather evidence. And so your book talks about all different types of evidence, and you should go through pages 91 through 94 to look at the different types of evidence that you might use to support a claim. You can use data from personal experience. There's a lot of strengths with using that kind of information. You might think that personal information or personal experience is not appropriate evidence, but it very well may be if you're writing some sort of first-person argument. I would want to hear what your personal experience or connection with with that particular evidence is. It really touches a lot of times somebody's emotion. So a lot of times you're using that pathos when you select data from personal experience, data from observation or field research. That is very useful. I use that a lot in the types of research that I do related to technology and learning. A lot of times in my field in English, we conduct case studies, and so I will observe a group of students, a class for a semester, and draw some conclusions based on that, and I will use evidence from that observation. So that's always a good thing. Interviews, questionnaires, surveys. Interviews are great. And can be very compelling if you have an expert in the field that and they can, it's sort of like having that first-person personal experience data, but it might come from a more credible source, but it still has that interest that a person would have if you conducted an interview and hear what somebody in that field might believe to know or have experience in that area. Of course, statistical data, you're very familiar with that kind of information. And then hypothetical examples, cases, or scenarios that you might frame up for your reader as, like if we did this, or if this were allowed to happen, imagine this scenario. So a lot of times that can be very effective evidence because it allows the reader to put him or herself in that new scenario. So that might be good. And then reasoned sequence of ideas. Sometimes arguments are supported with a reasoned sequence of ideas rather than with concrete facts or other forms of empirical evidence, like statistics and data. And Dr. King did that in his letter from a Birmingham jail. He oftentimes he would take a concept and break it down reason through concepts and ideas he had, and that, of course, is a form of evidence. So there's a lot of different ways. Please look at that in your book, and it will give you some ideas for the types of evidence that you might want to use. There are rhetorical strategies for framing evidence, just like I said at the very beginning. Sometimes, if we look here down this bottom example, sometimes you want to use a certain number, like instead of using the percentage, because it may indicate something less emotional. If you had the raw number, like if there were 17,000 troops that died one day in a battle, and you're putting forth an argument that we need to get out of Afghanistan or something, that's a very strong number, as opposed to maybe the percentage of that might only be like 1% of our, I know that's not true, of our troops, but you can see where a very large raw number might have a certain like impact, emotional impact on an audience. So there's a rhetorical strategy, a rhetorical move that you choose as the writer when you are selecting types of evidence and the way in which it is presented. So, okay, so rhetorical strategies for framing evidence. So controlling the space given to supporting versus contrary evidence. In other words, you are going to have contrary evidence in your piece, but the kind of space that you give that contrary evidence is controlled by you. It's got to be there because it shows that you are an open-minded and responsible writer, but you don't want to give it too much real estate in your paper necessarily, and that's a rhetorical strategy. Or you might want to give it more space. It depends on the resistance of your audience and the purpose. Remember that rhetorical triangle? So that's why you have to think about who your audience is, what your purpose for that paper is, so that you can present evidence in a strong way. Again, emphasizing a detailed story versus presenting lots of facts and statistics. So you might want to employ something that represents those facts and statistics in a story, and something anecdotal, something personal, but a story that represents those facts might be more compelling, again, depending on your audience and your purpose. Oftentimes, you're going to be providing some sort of context or interpretation of your evidence. That's part of your job as the writer. You don't just throw up evidence. There's some thought and analysis. Sometimes you have to provide this context, and you have to, like where this came, why this is significant. Sometimes you have to interpret the findings for your reader. That's a rhetorical strategy. You control that. So you can control the way they think about this evidence. Putting contrary evidence in subordinating positions, that's very similar to this top one here. When you depending on your audience and your purpose, where you put the contrary evidence in the paper is a strategy. So depending on how you think the reader is going to meet or understand your argument, how they're going to feel about it, you may want to subordinate or put lower the contrary evidence, which you do have to have. Using images, I can always tell when students like their topic because they actually will find an image to put in the paper, and it's not just for padding. That's not what I'm talking about. It is for, they have found an image that represents something that they are trying to support. They found an image for that, and it can be very powerful if it's used properly. And like I said, I can always tell when a student likes what they're writing about because they usually Well, they usually put an image in there, and I mean, I know that I like to search for images that relate. I like to do things like that support something that I'm thinking about, so I can always tell that they're engaged with the topic that way. So your book also talks about gathering evidence. So the main thing with gathering evidence is you really just sort of need to think about it before you set out and do it. Create a little brainstorm. If you know that you're going to interview somebody, or you might want to conduct an interview, you do have to think about those things ahead of time, because you have to set up the interview, or you have to create the survey and maybe get appropriate permissions to do that. For anytime you do a survey or something, you do need to get permission. So again, think about it first. Who can I talk to about this, or what kind of data do I want to gather? Like if you want to go observe a classroom, if you're doing something on, say, art in the schools or music education in the schools, maybe you want to go visit a school and observe a classroom and look at the students, observe what's going on, and provide some of that sort of observational data that you've got. So it's very important that you think about these things before you set out and do them. Obviously, have a plan. And actually, when we write our papers, we will plan for how we think we're going to gather the evidence and what types of evidence that we might need. We might need to go to scholarly sources. We might only have to do web searching. That you might decide that you want to talk about a certain personal experience, and so on and so forth. So you will think about those things in the planning stage of the paper, but having a game plan before you go in is really important. Okay, so the very last thing I want you to do, to think about, think about evidence or evidence to support a claim. I want you to go through the directions, the writing assignment, a microtheme on page 104 of your text, and it's option 1. That's what I want you to work on. You're not going to do supporting reasons, argument. And you're going to select one of the enthymemes to support or refute. If you're going to refute it, you need to reframe it, reframe the claim. And just follow the directions here, and you're going to post it. You'll see the link in that, in that week's folder to a discussion board, the free write place. So it won't be private. Others will see it, but just take a couple of minutes. It's just 2 paragraphs that you have to write, and they provide the claim for you. So it shouldn't take you more than an hour to do something like that. Hopefully it will take you less. I'm not grading it for grammar or anything like that. So I do want it to be in the spirit of a free write. That's why it's on that discussion board area, in the free write area. So look for that link in there, and just take 30 minutes to 60 minutes to complete that. Okay, I hope this helped a little bit with understanding how to perhaps use evidence effectively, and maybe you've thought about different ways to use evidence, or learned something new that could actually be evidence. So hopefully that was helpful to you.